Hey everybody, welcome back to the ProgCast. I've been getting your messages about doing some talks about some of my experiences with some of the great musicians that I've worked with, and I feel like it's valuable to pass on some of this information, some of these firsthand experiences with some of the great musicians of improvised music. I'm Gregg Bendian, and today I'm joined by one of my oldest and dearest friends, Tim Blackman. He's a piano player and someone that I consider an aficionado of the music of, let's just say, improvised jazz, creative music world, but he's also very knowledgeable about classical music. So we've had many in-depth discussions over the years, and I've chewed his ear off many times, and we're going to do a little bit of that today regarding the great Cecil Taylor and my time with him. So thanks for doing this, Tim. Welcome.
Hey, Greg, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it. Great to continue so many conversations with you about music over the years.
Oh yeah, it's we were just saying it's about 45 years now from high school, if not middle school, but yeah, 45 years. And Tim knows very well of my exploits and my thoughts about them. So I thought, who better to pepper me with questions about the great Cecil Taylor. So Tim, why don't you kick it off and we'll go for it.
Yeah, let's see. What do we want to start with? Well, so I guess to start, what brought Cecil Taylor to your attention? How did this happen? This come?
Well, we both grew up in Teaneck, New Jersey, and Teaneck is a very liberal town, very pro-education. We had excellent teachers from New York City. Our band director, Mr. Joseph Lavelli, was a Juilliard graduate and a student of Vincent Persichetti. So we got the real deal in terms of music education at an early age. And we had a really, really strong music collection at the Teaneck Public Library. And I think, like so many of the things that we got into, a lot of it came through reading Downbeat magazine, reading any music magazines. We're educating ourselves because there was that, and there was WKCR radio from Columbia University that would play such kinds of creative improvised music of all sorts. And I think a combination of listening to more and more progressive music and more and more looking for the next area of challenge, I moved away from rock music into jazz, traditional jazz, and then into what could be considered the avant-garde. Of course, the towering figures were Ornette, Coleman. Albert Ayler was very big in our view.
Art ensemble.
Art ensemble. Who else? All the AACM guys, Air.
Yeah, I remember listening to Timeless, the Abercrombie album. I remember getting that out of the library, and that was, then I listened to John Abercrombie albums after that,
Right. And
that mattered.
And the whole ECM catalog.
Yeah.
Which included so many of the great creative musicians like Keith Jarrett and all the people that we were listening to, Chick Corea. And I know that something about Cecil's playing struck me as being graspable, even though for many people it seems very cacophonic, if that's a word, and very dense and impenetrable. But to me, I guess I was able to hear his control on the instrument by listening to his solo unaccompanied piano stuff, and I feel like that's a big gateway into his music. Is maybe don't listen to the double album, group blowouts first, but if you listen to Indent, or if you listen to Air Above Mountains, any of those records, those early solo records, I think it's very organized. I think it's very clear when he's playing written material and when he's improvising and when he goes back to written material. And so as a young composer, a musical adventurer, I did find it exciting, very visceral. Also, like everything else in the New York area, we could get a record out of the library, hear the band, and it might likely be playing in New York City.
Just go.
So we would go to the shows, we would go to Soundscape, we would go to the Public Theater, we'd go wherever it was happening.
Right. I also wanted to say that, the thing you said about downbeat, I think is interesting because it seemed to me that this was just what you should listen to. I mean, it didn't seem that surprising. Like, of course we would listen to this.
Right. And this is something that has come up recently too, that I'm glad you mentioned that is we didn't know no better. This was just music happening at that moment. It was very much the music of our moment, I think, because we had done enough preparation to get to the point where, we're looking for the next challenging, exciting kind of musical approach that wasn't rock. So it was kind of anything outside that. So maybe even Weather Report leads us there, early Talent work and Wayne. And
I was also checking the dates, and 1978 for Body Meta and for Three Faces. So that was this moment that we started talking about music and go to the library, and that was would have been on the new, sitting out as a new record.
Three Faces and the green Cecil Taylor record on New World Records, which again it's a government funded NEA, I think, record label. So there was also enough interest publicly to get behind these guys and make sure their stuff was heard by the general public. And we were well served by that library. I got all the None Such Explorer stuff out of that library, right? So we heard music from other lands.
Gamelan music and
Yeah.
Kodo music.
Yeah, drumming from Africa. And I think that, and knowing that when you read Cecil talking about music and downbeat, as I did in high school, he's saying, I'm into Bartok. I'm into Stravinsky. I'm into African music. I'm into all sorts of things. And that's right away, that's my kind of guy, because I felt as though being very open musically was the correct stance. And that I didn't really know yet what I wanted to do. That's another thing. I was kind of exploring, do I want to play free jazz? Do I want to write it all down and wait for someone to play it, or ask for somebody to pay me to write something? No, we were self-starters. As you recall, we had our bands, we had our little groups in high school. We played tunes. We checked out interstellar space. So, we were doing that. We were trying to do structures and find different ways of verbal communication to get things to happen. So the AACM was big for that. And just knowing that guys like Cecil, you didn't always know exactly what they were going to do next, but they would change groups. They had regular groups, then they had collaborations. I think the spirit of it was very attractive to me because it was very open. I would come to find that it was less open in the community in terms of approaches as I got more into it. But no, the marching orders were, do your thing, check out everything you can. And then Cecil also said something that I read in Downbeat, which was never be ashamed of your influences. And I remember that taking pride in knowing, or not being ashamed of knowing classical stuff and how it reflects in someone like Cecil's music. I remember that being very inspiring and encouraging.
Huh. Yeah. So what do you think your understanding was of his music at the start?
A good question. On my basic level, I was definitely responding to the energy and the intensity. But I also remember finding a lyricism in there that was both present in his piano playing, particularly the balladic kind of stuff, but also in the presence of Jimmy Lyons in the band, where you have a melodic horn player who can shred like Charlie Parker, but he can play a melody, and he could play Cecil's melodies, and they would inhabit the world of breath rather than it being all about a percussion instrument. So there was something for us to hang on to in different ways, the different drummers that he had, Andrew Cyril, Ronald Shannon Jackson, particularly as you point out on Three Faces. They're completely different approaches. So then I saw that, he had different kinds of drummers. Right away, I saw that. Steve McCall, who was, someone I studied with in high school in an effort to get a handle on what's going on. Air had just moved from Chicago to the Lower East Side of Manhattan. They played a concert at William Paterson University, where I teach to this day. And we were in high school, and we saw Air, and said, Mr. McCall, can I study with you? And he said, well, we're coming to New York next month. I mean, the moment, right? The timing.
Right.
Andrew Cyril was playing, and you could go up to him and speak to him. And Mr. Cyril, would it be okay if I took some lessons with you? And, for what would be some of the most valuable interactions for a young guy that's trying to get a handle on what's going on. So it was very much accessible in a way. The guys were around. I don't know if you were with me, Tim, but like we'd be walking down 7th Avenue South, and there comes Cecil walking down the street. I was with some high school chums.
Is that how you originally ran into him?
First time I met him, but I was nameless at that point. I was just some guy that, some kid talking to him on the street, and he was happy to talk to us. My other friends knew who he was, and we said, "Oh, it's Cecil Taylor." Wow. And he's like, "Hi guys, how's it going?"
Huh.
So he wasn't aloof, and that was also again, like, there are very few of those guys that would have been kind of standoffish. I won't name the ones who were, but there were many of those guys were like, wow, anybody that's into this, cool.
Right. And of course you would take the step. You were fearless to go, and it's nice that they responded nicely, but you were willing to put yourself out there.
Right. And I wasn't discouraged when they were not nice, because I thought, well, he's nice. He might not be nice, but I'll go over here. Just the idea that it was happening. Can we get in on it? What could we possibly add to this? When you also begin to realize that Cecil was a guy who practiced a lot. Okay, I better get my chops together. I better get my technique together. I better be able to play my instrument, sound like I play my instrument. I think when you talk about first impressions, I didn't know that some free jazz drummers were better than others necessarily. I knew I liked certain ones, but many guys were self-taught. To quote Doug Lunn, the late great bass player, he said, some people are pre-traditional, some people are post-traditional. And the people who start as having a traditional sense and then move into being non-traditional seem to be the right route. So you want to be able to swing, you want to be able to transcribe Max Roach's solos, which is something that I did a lot of. Came in handy later. I'll tell you about that. So, the fact of the matter was things were popping. shows were happening, albums were coming out on major labels. They were available. And if you wanted to move from rock to something else, you could and did. And the shows in general, the concerts were very instructive. Like, how are they looking at each other? Are they cueing? Is there written music on stage? What's the practice? What's performance practice?
Right.
Right. So that was very instructive. But yeah, I mean, that's my recollection of the beginnings of it, was reading. Oh, also As Serious as Your Life, the Val Wilmer book.
Right.
The reading about these guys, anything you could find. There weren't a lot of books compared to now.
Right.
Now this is a serious area of academic endeavor, and pianists like Vicky Ray are playing transcriptions of Cecil's solo piano music. So that world, like, you really felt like you were at ground zero for something that was really bursting open. And it had been in existence for almost 20 years.
Right.
If we talk about the earliest stuff with Cecil and Nefertiti, the Beautiful One, and Spiritual Unity Eiler, that's like 61, 62.
Okay.
You might have the dates in front.
I noticed that Unit Structures, that was the first one I know, and that's 66.
Yes, but before Unit Structure,
but there was stuff before that. Yeah.
is Jimmy and Sonny Murray. So that kind of thing, where he had moved away from the Dennis Charles, Buell Neidlinger thing, where there's swing time, Cell Walk for Celeste, those kinds of things people would know as kind of, oh, he's jazz, but he's different. Yeah, it's starting to move there. Yeah, I think that it was important. It was made clear to me somehow that it was important to have a sense of what had come before, so that you could really decipher what was happening at that moment.
Right. So there was a pretty long time from this moment where you first ran into this until you actually, got going with Cecil. So it was about 10 years, I think, for you. So what was that development like, and how did that get you ready in various ways?
Oh, well, I mean, Derek Bailey really, finding a place in a improvised music scene, which was thriving in New York, so-called downtown scene at that time, with guys like Bill Frisell, John Zorn, Tom Cora, Ned Rothenberg, and seeing Derek come to New York and play with these guys at places like Roulette, where now we're seeing no material on stage. You have to create from zero. Every piece is a new beginning, a new universe. That was now a real left turn from hearing free jazz, which was very high energy. Now there were other strategies in place where people play quietly, or people play only noise, or people would play and then stop, and different groupings would emerge from a group. And I just started to think more wide open about what freedom was, or what improvisation was, what the goals were in terms of, when is a piece over? When does a piece, how does it begin? How does it end? What are we doing? What are we not doing in a piece? And I'd still been going to I saw, to my recollection, went every time Cecil played in New York. So I saw all the different groupings. I saw him solo. I saw him opening or double bill with Oscar Peterson solo at Carnegie Hall, where people were not happy with Cecil, and the way he was playing, but we were there rooting for him. And and of course, Oscar Peterson as well. I knew Cecil talked about Art Tatum. I knew that Cecil had a tremendous respect for the pianists that came before him. He knew them all. And that's another thing, noticing when a guy knows all this stuff, you better know a bunch of stuff. You better be really omnivorous and get as much as you can, because otherwise you'll miss something. Somebody will make a reference to something, you won't know what's going on, and then you're kind of standing there, flat-footed, and you couldn't be, because the one thing you'll get from those early listening and watching experiences that everyone's really clearly committed and serious about it. So if you're just listening to it, you might have the misconception of, oh, this is all random. But when you experience it in person and you see it, and Cecil comes out and it's like a classical recital, and he comes in, he sits down at the piano, and it's just about the music for an hour and a half or more. That shapes one's impression of what's really going on here. So we were lucky that it was so accessible, because, I talk to people all the time that were in Ohio or, in the South, and they just didn't have access to this stuff that we did. We were 7 miles from Manhattan. So yeah, it was definitely being caught up and pulled into this moment, this vortex of activity. And then, of course, going to hear Ornette every time he played, and, going to hear Frank Wright or Frank Lowe, or I got to see Donald Eiler play with Rashid at Soundscape, sing Sun Ra, being able to go talk to Sun Ra. Hey guys, how's it going? Wow. Like, you can't trade that for anything. They were happy to see us. I mean, honestly, let's face it, they would have been happy to see anybody, because it was still a form of underground to me. When I look at it, it was still a underground movement. It was not a mainstream movement, even though this is probably the peak of mainstream accessibility, right?
Right. But still, this was not AM radio. This is
no, and it wasn't FM radio really either. But so one could have the impression that, oh, this is just what's happening right now.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, so you were bouncing along here, and I guess you'd been working with Derek. I mean, how did this happen? How did it actually get going?
So eventually, I decided in '83, now's the time for me to start going into New York, meeting these guys, talking to them, and trying to get together and jam. So I remember early on playing with Tim Byrne at his place out in Brooklyn, just to do some playing, asking anyone at a show that seemed friendly, and that's how I ended up playing with Derek. He was playing with John Zorn and George Lewis, and had been getting into Derek's music and his whole circle, Jamie Muir, Hugh Davies, or Evan Parker, and went up to Derek and said, I'm a big fan. I'd really love to play with you sometime. And he said, how's tomorrow? So through that experience of a kind of boundaryless musical scene, I felt like I knew as much as I did. I knew Rashid's playing, and I knew Andrew's playing, I knew Steve McCall's playing. So I knew these so-called free jazz guys. But then I started hearing these other guys like Paul Lovins and Paul Litton and David Moss and Jerry Hemingway, and different drummers that were approaching this music each in their own way. So I thought, okay, those are the marching orders. I have to come up with my own thing. What is my own thing? Well, I really like contemporary classical percussion. I don't find too many of these guys that are that interested in that, and different tuned cowbells and metals and found objects like bottles and cans. And so I began developing this setup that would reflect a drum kit and a percussion setup. So it would mean preparing the drum set, clamping down the cymbals, or putting chains or vibrating things. But, I had picked that up from as much from Cage prepared piano as anything, because I was very struck by that idea that why did Cage do that? Because he didn't have room for a percussion ensemble on stage for the dance performance. And he's just thought, well, once you put your hand in there, it changes the sound. What if I put objects in there? Rubber erasers and nuts and bolts and things that will interrupt or sympathetically vibrate. Well, that can work on anything you hit. Piano's a percussion instrument. I can do that on a drum set.
Yeah.
And that kind of became my viewpoint. Was I don't know if I'm a free jazzer. I don't know if I'm an improviser. I don't know if because I was still writing chamber music. I was still very involved in percussion ensemble music, writing percussion ensemble, writing solo, performing solo. So by 84, 85, I was doing solo percussion tours, putting all my gear in the car and driving around the country and playing where I could, wherever they'd have me, in a gallery or opening for a rock band or at a university. And so this thing that happens to me frequently is, I don't know, it just something will pop into my head, prompted by, I don't even really know what, like, now is the time to do this. And I think it was 88. And like I said, I went to see Cecil play everything I could see him do. Sweet Basil with McCall and Thurman Barker and Rashid Bakar and William Parker, and always Jimmy Lyons around. We'd wait for Jimmy. Jimmy would stand over on the side, wait for 40 minutes for Cecil to finish his first solo, and then Jimmy would come in and we'd be like, yeah, Jimmy, all right, and he would totally destroy and take his time. Another thing of the idea of taking time to build up an idea. And I think at Symphony Space on the Upper West Side, Cecil was giving a solo concert, and I'm sitting in the audience. And when he's done, he goes off stage, and the stage door to backstage is right there, and it's open, and he's standing right there, smoking a cigarette or whatever he's doing, talking to people. Look, the door is open. I didn't push the door open. The door was open.
But you went through it.
Door's open. I went through it. Very respectfully said, Mr. Taylor, I'm a big fan of your work. He didn't remember me from the street or whatever. I said, I think I could contribute something to your music. And he looked at me and didn't bat an eyelash. And he said, when can I hear you? And I was at that point doing Gregg Bendian Project, which was my sort of chamber jazz group. I had no problem with telling him, we're playing next week at the Knitting Factory. If you want to come down, I'll put you on the guest list. And he said, okay, here's my phone number. Remind me. I reminded him. We went and played the show. At that point, I had acoustic bass, clarinet, percussion, and I'm trying to think about, I might have had cello or something at that point. It was very chamber jazz. So we would do Out There by Eric Dolphy and as a head and improvise, or we would do my kind of open structure, movable, mobile kind of compositions. We played the first set, no Cecil. Took a break, played the second set, no Cecil. And I'm thinking, oh man, oh well. And as we start packing up, Cecil walks in with a couple of friends. And I see him walk in. And as soon as I see him walk in, I say to everybody in the band, don't pack up. We're playing a third set. Right. So
Yeah.
I play solo first. I mean, what more could I do? I had been working on a piece dedicated to him in the chance that he would show up. So this is on my first solo percussion record, Definite Pitch, Polyanthus. And it was very much fast, clustery stuff with extreme jumps and extreme register kinds of things. And I dedicated to Cecil, and he was there. And he heard that. And then we played some other stuff, and he was still there at the end. And, we talked. And at that point, we sort of launched a friendship. I hung out with Cecil on and off, just going to shows, going to see Kabuki at Lincoln Center. I remember Treat Williams, the actor, being in the audience, recently passed away. He was there. Cecil always knew what was going on. So you would go to museums, you would go to see the latest Wim Wenders film, you would go to see dance, you would go to see all of this stuff. And so he was very cultured, and just the idea of being cultured and being aware and being well read, seeing that demonstrated in person. And Cecil was one of the smartest people I ever met. Just so intelligent and so intellectually curious, such a voracious reader. Everything he did was kind of extreme and kind of over the top. Now, you can try to keep up with that in your own little way. And I think I did. I mean, I knew I had to play solo. I knew I had to have a group. I knew I had to collaborate. He was a model. He was a kind of a role model for what a creative musician, artist type should be. So that was about a year of that. And then, of course, me saying things to him like, Cecil, I'm available. I'm available to play.
When you were talking with him, it was a conversation, right? I mean, was he interested in your ideas? Did you have to be quick on your feet? And what was that like?
Yeah, he'd ask you questions. Yeah, he would ask you questions. I remember one thing was that he felt he was in some way a revolutionary. Now, I don't know if a lot of people talk about this, but it was like his agenda was, I'm breaking down not maybe just musical boundaries, but cultural boundaries, by being interested in non-American resources, by being interested in the Bolshoi, by being interested in architecture from Corbusier, and being interested in poetry, guys like John Ashbery and Ezra Pound and James Joyce, and just the hard stuff, the stuff when you're in college, you're like really struggling with. And it didn't go away. It was clearly that's his agenda. Is I'm going to grow my mind. I'm going to grow by having more and more fodder for ideas for music, extra musical ideas. And that's another thing that struck me was you see people who are not necessarily writing music that's about music. It's, people have compared him to Jackson Pollock. Well, okay, but just the very notion that Cecil would have known all those painters and would have hung out with them and had drinks with them and could tell you stories. I would ask him for stories. He would tell me stories, but he also wanted to hear my music. So I remember vividly playing him a new flute piece that I had written for an Icelandic flute player that I was working with. And he sat there and he listened to it and he said, your song is very strong. You really are doing what you want to do. So that was a great vote of confidence. And yeah, I would play him recordings, and he would listen. So he was very open and available to in a way mentor, or it's just that certainly to just demonstrate how one navigates creative life. He was very important for the idea of building a thick skin. He told me about the wall, which was a concept that I had not known about. Is when you're in your world and you're doing your work, you have to put up the wall and exist within yourself to express the purest version of your vision of what it is. So you can't be freaked out if people in the audience are laughing or eating or even commenting negatively. And I had experienced that as well. I had guys come up to me and go back and say, it sounds like you're just warming up. What are you doing? I don't dig it. Like aggressively, and that's only a smidgen of what he must have experienced in inventing that whole approach.
Right.
Dissonance is tough. Dissonance is a deal breaker for many people. Let's face it, non-harmonic language separates an audience. But I also like that, as a high school student, went to a lecture by Steve Reich at Greenwich House, and he said, when I encounter music or art that I don't understand, I don't write it off and think, well, what's that guy's problem? I think, no, it's my problem. I have to figure it out.
Right.
And that's still my attitude. My attitude, I want to hear something that blows my mind. I have no idea what's going on, but I'm going to try to figure it out. I'll read about it. I want to know what your basic concepts are. I want to know what you're trying to accomplish. Maybe I can grasp it in some way, get a foot in the door somehow.
Oh, yeah. I certainly remember that the idea that there was something and you were going to have to figure it out. You knew how many times you were going to have to listen to it. It wasn't going to be pleasant at first because you don't know what it is. But if you listen to something enough times, if you read something enough times, you'll start to get a sense about it. But you have to be willing to push yourself.
There's a diligence that's required. And if you don't know that, and another great quote. Cecil was being interviewed with Max Roach on television by Studs Terkel. And as I did in the day, and I still have all these, put my cassette player right up to the TV speaker and recorded it. And so I heard Cecil say, artists are workers. I never thought of that, because we'd probably been brought up to think, artists, flighty, flaky, don't feel like it. Oh, I need inspiration. To start. No, Cecil was like, he's up every morning practicing, take a lunch break, practice for the rest of the day, and then go out and have fun at night. He was on a work schedule. So, witnessing that kind of thing, you get a pretty clear picture of what's going to be required of you. So being around that, and then of course his circle of musicians, everybody knew him. We got on the Circle Line boat to see Sonny Rollins play. Remember that, and people coming up to Cecil and talking to him. So I got to see Sonny Rollins at that moment. It was a good hang. It would be some really long nights, and I could sort of go as far as I could go in terms of energy, and then I would have to say, Cecil, I'm going to go, and he'd be like, okay, see you later, and he would go for whatever the next period of time was. He really was. It was impressive to be in his presence. And then, of course, whenever he played, he always sounded like he was in great shape, great playing shape. He jogged a lot at that time. I remember he was in incredible physical condition. You know, he had to be to play. He also knew a lot about sports. So one of the first people to make the connection between sports injuries and, as we now know, musical repeated stress injuries that happen to people that now doctors specialize. So he'd say, yeah, my left wrist hurts, but I'm going to play through it. Whereas, you know, he could have said, well, I'm not going to play because my left wrist hurts, but he'd know if it was serious enough.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, he certainly was a very athletic player. So I guess he would have to be careful. And I'm right. He wasn't a young man. I mean, I guess it looks to, you know, 50s, 60s when you were working with him, I think. So I think we know what that's like now. And yeah, you gotta be careful.
Yeah. And he would tell me about sports, and I would say, Cecil, you like boxing? It's so, you know, savage. And he'd say, very fast hand movements. You know, so that idea of finding something in everything, I may have learned from him. You know, you're not interested in, I don't know, hockey, but those guys, they're moving at 1,000,000 miles an hour with this little object that's going hundreds of miles an hour, flying. You know, if you don't think of it as a sport, you think of it as an impressive human achievement. Physicality is in his music. So anything that's physical, dance, sports, he's checking it out. Now, I had been involved in sports, so this resonated with me. And I worked on my, you know, technique so that I could play fast without getting tired, or play fast without losing control. I was lucky to have a really good classical teacher, Gary Van Dyke, who showed me the correct technique, why you use the correct technique so that you don't injure your arms and get carpal tunnel syndrome and need surgery like some rock drummers that I won't name. And, you know, it was serious. You know what I mean? It was like as serious as your life, you know, that was it.
Right. Well, so you'd been peppering him with these suggestions. When did he follow up with you?
I would do things like, Cecil, I'm in your neighborhood and I have my drums. And he'd say, one of the great lines was, is that how you think this works?
Yeah.
But yeah, so eventually what happened was, I was gigging, but I was working temp jobs, office jobs, anything to pay the rent. And I was working in an office, and I, would get up every day and I have to be there by 9 or whatever it was. And in March of '89, he rings me up at 7 a.m, and I wake up from a dead sleep. And it's Cecil, and he would never say, hi, it's Cecil. It was just right into talking, which I've now found is something a lot of these kinds of guys do. Like, you know who it is. So it's ding, hello. Are you available to play with us this evening in Cambridge? Tony Oxley is unavailable. Now, I had seen Cecil with Oxley recently, so that was another boost, because first white drummer to play with Cecil, non-traditional jazz / new music guy from England, but his setup was all idiosyncratic little objects and self-made instruments and really strange sizes of things and detuned bongos. And when you see that, you're thinking, oh, I'm following Tony Oxley. It's all good.
It's open.
I'm not following Shannon Jackson. because that would have been hard because I didn't know that you could go away from that. But Shannon Jackson, I want to say, was valuable to me because I heard for the first time someone laying down a steady pulse against all the cacophony and all the maelstrom of sound, and thought, oh man, that takes some guts. And of course, Shannon had played with Eiler and Ornette and then Cecil. So following Tony Oxley on the band, I drove up, I think I picked up William Parker and we drove up to Boston to play at the Western Front in Cambridge, which I don't think is there any longer. And no rehearsal, no pre-discussion. And that you come to know that this will be the pattern. He's not going to tell you what or how to play. So you better have some idea of what you do or don't want to do. I was so excited on those first gigs. I played too loud. I remember that. People were complaining, the drums are too loud. So I, right away started thinking about that, better come up with some brush stuff, some mallets, laying out. Because it was good feedback, to hear, for people to say, well, you're too loud. I never wanted to be too loud. I still take great pride in my quiet playing, and that takes a lot of control and technique to be able to play quietly. Well, then work on that. So I'm already starting to kind of hone in on what my approach would be. And after a few gigs, then I started preparing the drums and changing the sound of the kit and adding percussion items on a table, and then bringing in the vibraphone and trying to play pitch things with him, because I had seen Thurman do that on marimba. But yeah, it was like you were thrown in. You were just thrown in.
The fact that you had heard him with Tony Oxley just before, did that give you a hint about where he was at that moment?
Yes, where Cecil was.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this had shown me that you can't assume it is exclusively a Black music form. It's a creative music form. Whomever he needs to challenge him or try to go in a different direction, that's all good. He was good with that. I love that. I love knowing that. And then, he'd also played duets with Max Roach at that point. So you see, Max was a huge role model for me as well, because I knew Max had been working with dancers and working with video artists and working with rappers and working with electronic people and working with video. And so Max was a big role model for me in that too, because now here he is playing with Cecil. And he played time. And Cecil's doing Cecil. So then there's another guy who's thinking about time. One time I was hanging out with Cecil and I said, Cecil, what was it about Steve McCall for you? And he said, the time.
Yeah.
Not a lot. I mean, you're not going to get really long explanations. I mean, but just to get a little window into, time. Simultaneously, I've been reading Downbeat, and Paul Motion has an article, and I'm a huge Paul Motion fan at that point. Still am to this day. Armenian drummer, composer, band leader. Yeah. And he was in the phone book. So you could call him up and ask him questions and bother him. And he would say, hey man, what are you doing? You writing a book? But he liked it. He's like, oh, this Armenian kid, he's calling me up and asking me stuff. He didn't hang up on me. We talked on the phone. So another funny thing about that is that when I got the Cecil gig, I called Paul. I was so excited. And he said, tell Cecil I said, happy birthday. I said, what is, yeah, we have the same birthday, March 25th. I said, really? You have the same birthday as Cecil? So he knew that. You know, they had never played together. And I would think things like, what if Paul Motian had played with Cecil?
Wow.
What if Jack DeJohnette had played with Cecil?
Right.
And so the things that I gleaned from Motian and DeJohnette and drummers who hadn't played with Cecil, I thought, well, their approaches could work with Cecil's music.
Right.
So, like if you listen to the record I did with Cecil in Fluorescence, I think there are definitely moments on there where I'm playing rim shots the way Paul Motian would have to get more color out of the drum. You know, there are definitely some Paul Motian references on that record. So, and the cymbal use. Yeah, so Cecil never told me how to play. He never told me what to play. One time he told me, maybe don't play so loud in here. It's a very high ceiling. But generally he'd give a compliment. He'd say, oh yeah, you took care of it tonight, you know. I never felt anything like a musical adversarial thing with him, but I did feel it from the critics, and I did feel it from the writers and some of the audience who were thinking, you know, who's this little white kid playing with Cecil? And that's fair, you know. I mean, it was certainly not something you saw all the time. I wasn't Tony Oxley, so I didn't have stature in the scene. But I also thought it was funny because in the back of my mind, I had, I'm following Tony Oxley, guys. There's nothing for you to really complain about here. Clearly, Cecil told you by having Tony Oxley, I'm going to have whoever I want,
right,
if they're playing something interesting.
Right. Yeah. So I just threw you into it. I mean, you must have, over time, you must have figured out some things like, would you know what tune he was playing? Did you approach a given tune the same way each time?
Right. No, we didn't. So a little bit about Cecil's notation system. He would have a paper, just blank white printer paper, you know, on his, or maybe even a spiral notebook on his piano. And he would just write note names, just A, B, C sharp. And then in relation to each other, they might be above or below each other, but they would occupy, say like a quadrant in the page. And then each of those would be maybe chord ideas or maybe pitch classes or something that he was going to work off either in a triadic fashion, as you know, he'd do contrary motion.
Were they multiple parts? So like his left hand below the right hand part? Or?
It looked like right hand, left hand. It did. So those kind of you could see them, but they weren't indicated rhythmically. They were just groupings of notes. And so, yes, they would come out more than once in a tour, or, you know, you'd hear these musical ideas. But the very modern, but it's jazz still, the idea like, well, Miles was doing all blues slow, and then he did all blues fast. You know, Miles' tempo changes and stylistic changes were the de rigueur. You know, I mean, it was not odd that you would play a tune as a ballad, but some other night you might play it fast. So I was already down with that. I mean, that was fine. You could play it long, you could play it short. And yes, things would come back and you would say, well, I did this last time, I'm not doing that this time. Right? Because that's kind of built in, not spoken about, but if you're paying attention, okay, one of our strategies is material is going to be that day's version of the material, how he feels on that day. How do you feel on that day? What are you going to say about it? You know, what are you going to add? And that's the same thing for William Parker. You know, he would play some things arco, he played some things pizzicato, and it wasn't set. And he knew that. So I'm watching, William also was a great person to study because he'd been there for so long. He also taught me about not getting pulled into Cecil's mood swings, where Cecil might be pissed off about something and taking it out on the band. And, he might be unhappy, but then another time he'll be like super energetic. And I'm a kid watching every move and thinking, oh, is
Oh,
Cecil mad at me? Or is
oh,
Cecil...
you have to stay calm,
So
stay
you had to.
centered.
I didn't know that. I learned that on that gig. You can get yelled at 5 minutes before you go on, and you got to go on and play the music. Now, if you read jazz history enough, that kind of thing didn't just happen in Cecil's band, right? We knew the stories of Miles punching Coltrane and stuff like that. I mean, Cecil was never violent, but, he was moody. And so you had to ride that wave and still be inside the music and, not get pulled into personalities. And I had never experienced that before, really. I mean, I've been in politically charged musical situations before, but this was, you're playing with one of the guys that you'd always admired and you'd think is just the shit and just the real deal. And if he was unhappy, it was very difficult not to be affected by that. But then you learn how you don't want to be as a band leader. Watching other band leaders and how they treat their band, you learn a lot about what you don't want to do.
Right. So when you were playing, was there eye contact? Did you watch him? Did you watch William? How did that go?
Well, William never looked up, but
Yeah.
But Cecil would occasionally, he would look up like, I'm coming to the end of something, or, I'm checking out what you're doing. I'm cool with it. Cueing, not necessarily cueing. And I think that's something that is important to know too, that audible cues start to become a big part of the music. When he's winding down, when it can keep going, that it's going to go for a little bit, or it's going to be quiet now. And so as free as it is, it's still you following Cecil's music. He's the music. You're accompanying him, but you still have a voice in it. You're arranging so that what he's doing could be clear. You don't want to, as I did in the early, gig, cover up what he's doing, because it's about, he's the music, he's the direction, and you're following that direction, and you want to be prepared to do something interesting. But I also employed some things that I had not heard other drummers do, like laying out. Because when you're playing with Derek and you're playing with improvisers, sometimes you don't play. Sometimes you stop and you listen and you let other people take it, and their direction changes where the music's going. So now you have to then adjust your thinking, because I always felt that it was useful to have some preset idea before you start free improvising, that you can either eschew, or, you can really, hone in on if you need it. Sometimes it's obvious. I don't know how obvious, but obvious to me what I need to do. Okay, well, if he's playing quietly, I'm not going to suddenly come in loud. Or wait a minute, see where it's going before you jump in.
Right.
Don't just jump in all the time.
Right.
So it's partially trying not to make a fool of yourself, but it's also, trying to be musical. And I liked him playing solo, and I liked hearing him play with William to sort of shine a light on what the two of them were doing. So I could lay out, or I could go to brushes, or I could go to something that was very unobtrusive. And then all of a sudden you're hearing them play duo. And so that kind of thing of being prepared enough to, or mature enough to not overdo it and to know whose music it is and what it is, and not, well, look, a big part of it is you don't want to screw it up. I don't know if that's even too obvious to say, but you don't want to mess it up. And I'd heard enough drummers mess up free jazz situations, too loud or too much. And, I'm listening to the sax player. I want to hear the sax player and you. I don't want to just hear you covering up the sax player.
Right.
And you get enough dirty looks early on, or you get enough feedback, and then you're learning on the job.
Right. Now, he wasn't following you. You were accompanying him, right?
Yes, I'd say that you could hear me respond to him. And sometimes I think you could hear him respond to me, but that wasn't typical. It was, he knew what he wanted to play, and it was just up to you to decide what to do with it.
Right. Yeah. So you've done this. You had done a few of these gigs. How did the recording come about after that?
Well, that's another funny story of someone not showing up. I only later found this out because I was at my office job. I still had the office job because it was a couple months into me joining what was called the Field Trio. It was Cecil Taylor Field Trio, and I got a call or I checked my messages. I wish I could recall exactly. It's, check your machine. And can you be at RCA Studios at 4 p.m. today? And I was at work. So I had to figure out a way to leave work early. And to this day, I thank my elementary school friend, Brad Jones, the bass player, who we were sharing a house at that time, musician house in Teaneck. I said, Brad, I just got called for the Cecil record. There's no way I'm going to be able to get home, pack up my stuff, and get to the gig, to recording in Midtown. Would you please help me, get my gear together? And he's like, yeah, okay. Wonderful thing of Brad to do that. And so I, rushed home, got my gear, went to RCA Studios, which is no longer there. It was one of the great recording studios where Toscanini recorded. So we recorded in the Toscanini room, beautiful wooden room where panels could be moved to change the acoustics of the room. Panel materials could be changed to alter the acoustics.
Yeah. And
I get there and I'm setting up, and I find out from the producer, John Snyder, who was now producing this whole series of American Jazz Masters for A&M Records. I mean, I find out we're on a major label. I find this is a major label records. And we knew Cecil's records. There were no major labels in America that were putting his stuff out.
Right.
So the ante gets jumped pretty fast. And then he says to me, John Snyder says, yeah, we were trying to make this a reunion with Cecil and Sonny Murray. And Sonny Murray didn't show up. Now, it's funny because Andrew Cyril told me that's how he got the gig. When Sonny Murray stopped showing up, there was Andrew. So I have this experience of now finding out it's Sonny Murray was going to be the drummer on the trio. And do I have to play like Sonny Murray? I didn't think twice about it. I thought, first of all, I love the idea of doing a studio record with Cecil because there were really very few ensemble studio records. I think previous to that, there'd been Unit Structures and, the couple of Blue Notes, Conquistador. the New World Records. And here we are in the studio where you can play quiet and you can get a good sound. And my drum kit could be well recorded, and piano would be a beautiful piano sound and wouldn't be out of tune right away. And, the bass was going to get recorded direct and with a microphone. And, it was top notch. Joe Lopes, one of the great recording engineers, he was the recording engineer. Jay Newland was the assistant engineer who went on to do incredible things. So it was a really good atmosphere to go into, where we're taking time to get the right sounds. We didn't run through anything. These have been pieces that we played live. I recognize them. Saida.
Oh, you knew them by names. Had he called out the names?
No. I did not know them by name. I knew them by sound.
I see.
So you get an idea of what, like, Saida would maybe be a kind of a ballad thing, but you're feeding off of whatever he's doing. It might have been something we played fast and long, but now we have this idea where John Snyder wanted Cecil to do shorter pieces because it's on A&M Records. There's a chance to maybe reach a few more people, because John knew, well, what's the Achilles heel of Cecil's music is, he plays long and the audience can't hang. Now he's got to present him to a major label buying audience. And that series, which was incredible, had John Cherry Multiculti, there's a Frank Morgan, there's Max Roach Quartet, there's Sun Ra.
Yeah.
It was a cool series. And so, John had gotten Cecil to agree to do short pieces. And then in the middle of it, we took a break, and Cecil said, we've been asked to do solo pieces. So I think William played a solo piece, and then I played very spontaneously. He said, go ahead. And I said, this is for Steve McCall. And I played that short 1-minute snare drum piece. And then when I was done, I said, was that okay? And they said, yeah, do another one. Now, I didn't know they were going to use them both. So now I go completely to the non-jazz world, and I'm starting to do bowing cymbals and sheet metal, and chains are rubbing, and everything's kind of textural. I wanted to create something that would develop over a little bit of time. And it's still a short piece, but Entity became the second piece. And then Cecil did his solo piece.
Oh, in that same gesture.
Time.
Okay.
Everyone's going to do their solo pieces and other people are going to just hang. And then other strategies, and what I was doing too on that was employing this idea that I had been doing with Derek, which is every piece I want to try to approach it differently, make it special. One piece I'll play brushes, one piece I'll play sticks, and one piece I'll play quick changes between loud and soft and brushes and mallets. And one piece I'll use percussion table, and another piece I'll prepare the drums and the cymbals. And not a peep, Cecil's fine with that. No one's ever saying to me, I think in a way, John Snyder might have been relieved that, at least this drummer's not blowing a bunch of BS all over the place. He's, considering each piece.
Well, Gregg, was this not what you had been doing when you were playing with them, live? Was this different in the studio?
This was like a condensed version of what I had been doing live at that point. And it was, like I say, an ideal platform because the sound in the room's amazing. You can hear everything. We weren't set up far away. There was baffles between us, but I think we had headphones. And you could play in a way that wasn't the way you played live, because when it goes down to quiet, there's no tinkling glasses or people chit-chatting. So there's much more of a sense, I think, on Inflorescence of a chamber feel to the thing, where you could play gently or meticulously, and it would translate. It wouldn't be like going like this, where people are there for the energy or people are there for so it's a unique setting in this way in his discography. So then things like laying out, I would stop suddenly. And then even on another piece, Charles and Thea, I didn't play at all. So it became a duet between Cecil and William. And no one ever said to me, "Why aren't you playing?"
Yeah.
So you're able to, it was a really unique situation because everything counted. There was nothing thrown away. I think we didn't do multiple takes of things, but I remember the session taking 8 hours. There might have been 2 takes of some things.
I see.
And then at the end, Cecil told us what we were getting paid, and it was not insignificant. It was a really serious chunk of change. And also found out then, I was getting publishing. So I was going to retain publishing for my solo pieces. And then at the end of the session, John Snyder said, "Let's just do one more thing, just play completely free." Now, I want to tell you a Jimmy Lyons story that was told to me by Lewis Porter. To think that these gentlemen were just winging it you could have that misconception. You could think, oh, it's just so random and they're just, blowing their guts out. But Lewis Porter told me he did a duet saxophone concert with Jimmy Lyons. And Jimmy Lyons and he were putting together the material for the concert, tune of Lewis, tune of Jimmy, maybe a Cecil tune. And then Lewis said to Jimmy, "And then I want to just play a free piece." And Jimmy said, "Oh, I don't play free. I play off of material."
Huh.
So,
so what does that mean then about that piece? So this is the last piece on the album, Feng Shui. And it does sound a little different. I thought that the interaction style was different.
Maybe that's what it is. I mean, maybe that's at the point where we're on equal footing and it's less about Cecil following Cecil and more about, well, what are you guys going to do as a group?
Right.
And there's that long pause in the middle of it where you just hear the lower register ring. Another thing that you don't hear a lot in Cecil's music is just the band stops and then there's and having the good sense to say, wait, this is a cool moment, don't blow it. So I waited for Cecil to change the moment, and then it starts up again. And yeah, it is and then it's a 3-way publishing split on that tune too.
Right.
So that was handled like properly. These are Cecil's tunes, this is a group composition, which I think really is what free improvisation is group composition. And yeah, that was the last thing on the session. And you can tell because the piano's been knocked out of tune.
What kind of piano was it? Do you remember?
The Bösendorfer.
It was a Bösendorfer. I thought so because it had that. There's this, those sounds that they sound like hitting metal plates because they're so low.
So, he asked for the Bösendorfer. He used the Bösendorfer. When he had the extra low notes, they were there for a reason. Yeah, I just wish there had been a, on session piano tuner.
Yeah.
That would have been something. Cecil Taylor is going to come in and play the piano for 8 hours. You might want to have a tuner on hand. Yeah.
This is a workout for everyone, including the piano.
Yeah. Other than that, really smooth session. Cecil was happy. It went smoothly. It was, then in the middle of the session, he hands us text. So we got sheets of paper that had his poem about the goddess of green flowing waters, which I believe was a Aztec goddess that, he had been always studying other cultures and ancient civilizations. And so he didn't tell us how to pronounce any of these names, any of these sounds. It was completely interpretive. So you choose what part of the page you wanted to read and vocalize. And that piece, that's the longest piece on the album. I think it's like a 10-minute piece. And that was then envisioned as a something happening in a almost ritualistic setting in a larger hall. The reverb is increased, the spatialization of the people is increased. Doing vocal sounds, Williams doing vocal sounds, Cecil had been doing vocal sounds, as we knew he did in his concerts anyway. And that was near the end, and I think that was the thing. So the record is kind of almost the way we ran the day in sequence. I think
another thing I noticed about that tune is it seemed like it reminded me more of a contemporary classical piece. That one, Cecil's textures seemed more varied, and it seemed like you interacted more. Maybe, well, I don't know why. Maybe because while he was making vocalizations, you were more open to do other things.
Right. So I played percussion table rather than drums. I don't think there's really any drum set playing on that goddess piece. And of course, I had great moments where Cecil, would come to see one of my concerts and he'd come backstage and ignore everybody in the room and just say, "Bendian, did you hear the new Elliott Carter?" Yeah, I did. Let's talk about it, Well,
what did he say about that sort of music? When you talked to him about that, what did he say?
Well, don't forget, if people followed Cecil's solo career, they know at a certain point in the 90s, early 90s, he's doing duo concerts or split bill with Roger Woodward, the great Australian pianist who was a Xenakis specialist.
Wow.
They would switch who play first half, who play second half, but you'd hear a lot of piano that night and Xenakis solo pieces and then Cecil solo. And of course I asked Cecil about it. He's like, "Oh yeah, we're very interested in Xenakis, and I are very interested in sound masses, and we're very interested in orchestrating on the instrument." And so we'd have like specific conversations. Like, it wasn't surface detail. He was really interested in Xenakis. He was genuinely interested in Bartok. He was genuinely, Cecil, what's your favorite Stravinsky piece? Agon. Not even, don't bat an eyelash. Like, right. Doesn't choose a classic, goes right. With, do you know Agon? Well, that's from his tone period,
Special sound.
It's a different Stravinsky. And so it's not like he knows all the first few Stravinsky pieces that everybody knows. He's deep catalog. So then you go and check out Agon, like, I gotta get on this Agon thing, Yeah. Constantly, learning about that.
Well, and it's interesting that he might have been willing to analyze that music when he wasn't willing to talk about the stuff you were doing with him.
Well, he certainly appreciated it. I mean, to what degree he analyzed things, I think his ears were incredible. I think his ears could tell him so much, because, what you get with Cecil, I think that's important, is form. There's a kind of form that's imposed on something that seems like it's totally free. So to me, he's keeping track of which notes he's using, which notes he's not using, and then he's keeping track of when all the notes, that's the title of one of the documentaries,
right?
All the notes. So then there's the time when it's all the notes are possible, and so there's so I found that contrast was in his MO. he was interested in contrast, registers, high, low, right? And that he call and response with himself. He did talk about call and response with him when he's playing piano. Like, here are the high voices, here are the low voices.
Right.
You know, so I know that he was orchestrating, and I knew that he knew orchestral music, and you could talk to him about it. So for that reason, I felt not just comfortable, but compelled to act in kind with how I approached my kit. You know, no drums for a while, no bass drum, just snare drum, just cymbals. You know, these were things that I heard in other kinds of music, but certainly when you hear it in his music, you're saying, well, obviously the guy is organizing on some level what he's doing, even if it's broadly, like register or volume or density. You know, and knowing that he had read about Stockhausen and that he had, gone to the premieres of classical music concerts when these pieces were new, Night Fantasies by Carter, just knowing that he cared about classical was huge for a kid coming out of classical that loved atonal music and Varese and, even Zappa and all the flurries of Zappa's music. They're not unrelated. Everybody's responding to modern art in some way, contemporary art. So you should be too.
Right. Well, what do you think I mean, this only lasted for so long. What did you take from it going forwards? Did you continue to use, I mean, we're not going to find somebody else who plays the piano this way.
No.
So what remains?
What remains is just the idea that you have to do your own thing. Certainly, organization of seemingly wild and woolly ideas, more control than you think is obvious on the surface is in play. Thinking of a group as both a jazz group and a chamber group. I got called to play with a lot of, Cecil wannabes after that. I worked with pianists that thought that they were, coming out of Cecil, but I found them sort of lacking in terms of that control and the contrast and just, the idea of a form. I was, having studied composition in high school, I was early thinking about form. I wanted to know what the beginning, middle, and end of anything would be. Why? Why would you do that in the middle? How does this end? Little things, which are huge things like that. You could say they're little things, but they're kind of the biggest things.
Right.
Organizing. So solo, organizing it. Group, organize it. Even if it's totally improvised, have some sense of organization, which I think is also why the last piece, Feng Shui, makes sense on the record, because we had done so many other things that day. We didn't do that yet. So now, what didn't you do yet? So the freshness, the idea of renewal, but you see, again, I remember studying Boulez and Boulez saying constant renewal. The reason you have so much trouble following Le Marteau is constant renewal. It's not repetitive. Right. So, you kind of had this idea of verboten, too much literal repetition. I can get with that, because literal repetition can be boring. So what if you say there's no literal repetition? There's only organic transformation in anything. Isn't that what's cool? and I put that into my flute piece, or I put that into my string writing, or whatever it is. So yeah, it was a confirmation that you could be interested in all of your things and find a way to weave them together, and maybe it would make sense to other people besides you.
Right.
Maybe that's the greatest lesson of Cecil for me.
Right. I mean, I've been noticing his name mentioned by artists now. I'm not sure, I don't know if that always was happening, but I'm noticing it now with pianists and so on. And I wonder if some of it is that just the idea that you could have your own idea, and it's okay to have your own idea and carry it out. It could be anything. And because if he was the thing that surprised me is if he came up with a radical idea about how to restructure music, why wouldn't he try to get other people to do his restructuring? But he didn't seem to do that, right?
He didn't seem to be interested that much when he did get larger forces, either his Orchestra of Two Continents or the FMP thing, where he went over and played with the European groups and had larger groups. He didn't get into micromanaging that, to my chagrin, in many ways, because I wanted to hear that implemented,
Yeah.
in an ensemble.
Yeah.
The closest I got to experiencing that was when he was commissioned by the Kronos Quartet to do a string quartet. And they only got what he put in front of himself in the piano, which was note names. So he gave the string quartet groupings of note names, pitch classes, whatever you want to call it, and said, you go now, make this into something. So performer involvement,
Wow.
clearly huge for him every day of the week. So it's string quartet, Kronos quartet, you guys figure it out. Here are the notes. And I went to the premiere, and it sounded like Cecil's triadic movements and his note groupings, and it came across. And to me, that was very rewarding, because I knew it worked. And then I basically adjusted that idea and used the idea of pitch names only, not register specific, but chords that would be explored in pieces like I zones and sleeves of alloy and some of my pieces that would just be about notes that are not, 4 notes at a time,
Right.
5 notes at a time. Before you move on, deal with these notes, because it's not all the notes all the time.
Right.
That I definitely got from working with Cecil and seeing his scores and seeing his methods. But then you also saw it in Feldman, where, he's just dealing with 6 notes at a time or 4 notes at a time and just displacing them. And isn't that interesting? Oh, it's as a second, it's interesting, but as a ninth, it's also interesting. What about that? And then that idea of close, wide, close. And you see those things as generalities, but they are existing in his music and in other composers' music. Now, the way people treat materials, everyone's different, but generally, pitch classes, as you know, that was nothing new, right? And inverting things, reimagining an idea, resetting, variation, that's in his music.
Yeah.
So yeah, I learned a lot in that time. It was probably the better part of a year. We continued to do shows after the record, playing festivals. We played at Lincoln Center, at Alice Tully Hall as a trio, and we're in Lincoln Center now. We're playing in a chamber music hall. So I'm going to bring orchestral percussion in addition to my drum set. And again, Cecil was into it. Never said don't do that.
Orchestral, like chimes or timpani or
no concert bass drum, tempo blocks, vibraphone, glockenspiel, this kind of stuff. Anything to expand, because it's a trio. So conceivably, there's space.
Yeah.
for everybody to do stuff. I mean, I love that William played with the bow and pizzicato, I continued to always write for bass players that play with the bow. That turns it over to chamber, because not a lot of jazz bass players were, adept at the bow. So yeah, it's an incredible experience that I treasure, and I still think about it. And, I encourage people to listen to Inflorescence, because it's a unique record in his discography. There's so many, but very few just studio recordings.
And the short pieces.
Right. And that was a funny thing about the short pieces, because through the short pieces record, more people have come to know his music from college, because when free jazz or that avant-garde jazz would be taught, they could just drop down, on one of the pieces on Inflorescence and say, this is what it is in 4 minutes. Get it? And so that's how Milford Graves and I became friends, is he was using it to teach at Bennington.
Yeah.
So when I met Milford, he knew me from the Cecil record. When I met Bill Dixon teaching at Bennington, he used the same record. So Bill Dixon, again, another guy that had played with Cecil, appreciated that record. And I think in a way, it was a record that people had been waiting for, like Cecil Bite Size and Fly, 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 Fly.
Right.
Had short pieces also.
Same thing. Yeah.
So I think we knew that already before I recorded with him, of course. And so, yeah, that was one other time where he wasn't only long form. I mean, okay, a lot. But
there was another possibility.
Of course. And he would, of course, he would have explored that. And he did.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there you have it.
Quite a story. Yeah, quite an opportunity to, when I first heard this album, right? This is the album, right? And to hear your sounds with him, these sounds that I had already heard with you, funny little damped cymbals, or like things with malice and stuff, like, wow, what a surprising experience.
Right. And the go ahead, that you could do it and no one batted an eyelash. Proved to be, yeah, the idea that when you say, I want you to do everything that you want to do, and I'm not going to say, but don't do that. I adopted that. I adopt it now. I use it in the Mahavishnu Project. I'll tell the guitar player, I want you to do everything you want to do. I don't want you to play like John McLaughlin. We'll play the material.
Right.
But when it comes to improvising, I'm giving you the keys to the car. Please feel free to use them. And really? Like, no, really. And then they do it, and I don't say anything. And then they're like, oh, I guess he means it. Because that's what I was exposed to. The guys who said, do whatever you want. When Ornette said, do whatever you want to me for the timpani part that I played on La Statue, he meant it. And he never said, don't do that. He said, do whatever you want. And I did whatever I wanted. And he said, cool. You got to hand it to those guys. They meant that, because another great lesson is that if ideally jazz is a democratic music. Now, there may be leaders, there might be an echelon system, but the voices do get some sort of egalitarian treatment along the way. And that's not necessarily true in orchestral music, is it?
Well, it's not always true in jazz music either. This wasn't a cutting session. They weren't out to make you look like a fool. The idea was to bring everybody's best together. Presumably it was engaging for him. This is what he wanted. Right.
And what he genuinely sought and achieved successfully on a regular basis. So I knew it was real. I knew it was not only about him. And when you look at the groups where it's contrapuntal in nature. I think that's interesting. Multiple voices engaging.
Right.
That's Carter too. Think about
Oh,
the
yeah.
second string quartet, it's four independent voices. And, that did not get past people like Cecil. If you know that one of the options is everybody's not listening to each other, what do you get? Different kind of energy. And also the city music. I think Carter and Cecil, it's New York City music.
There's a lot going on all the
They would
time.
both tell you that. It's boisterous, it's clang and bang, it's everybody talking at once. You get enough parties and club situations and you're listening and you're trying to follow four different conversations that are going on around you. That was training. I did that. Listening to what Cecil's talking to Butch Morris about while I'm listening to two of his friends talk about Cecil. I'm listening to two other people talk about something unrelated. And yeah, I think that's really what it is. It's real city music. It's city slicker music. It's you don't get that music if you live in the countryside of Vermont, George Crumb comes up with that music because he's coming from the farmlands of Pennsylvania, I believe. And it's a totally different soundscape. So
right.
I think there's something to that.
Huh.
Maybe we should leave it there, Tim.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Gregg.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to talk with you about this stuff.
Fine.
Well, everybody, my guest host, Tim Blackman, thanks so much for the friendship and all the great years of chats and really going for the details. And thank you, everyone, for watching the ProgCast. We've got a lot more stuff coming up with some of the key figures from British Prog and elsewhere. As always, stay tuned. Please hit us on Patreon. Please like and subscribe, and we will keep it coming for you. A lot of more stuff coming this year. See you next time. Thanks, Tim.